Welcome to another episode of Jeff Smith's Garage. This time we're going to be doing some chassis work. This is my 66 big block Chevelle that we're slowly starting to put together. And we thought we'd show you how to install a set of Aldan coilover shocks front and rear. So before we get into the actual installation, let's talk a little bit about each of the individual shocks. So for the front, this is a single adjustable shock from Aldan. Has 6 adjustments on it. It's nitrogen gas charged. And the whole, really the advantage to all this stuff is the coilover package allows you to adjust the ride height very simply. You can see there's a Torrington bearing right there that'll take the friction out of it as you adjust it. The tool comes with the kit to adjust it once we get everything installed. And then the springs for this particular package are 550 pounds per inch because this is a big block. The small block cars would be a little bit less. You can also see this spring is tapered. This part goes up inside the original spring pocket in the frame, so you don't have to do any modifications to the frame at all. And then this fits over the base on the shock absorber. So fairly simple system, really. For the rear suspension, there's a little bit more hardware involved. This particular bracket, for example, on the early Chevelles, the shock absorber mount is a little mount that looks about like this on the rear end. And if you put any kind of load on it, like in the old days when you put shock absorbers on those things, it would just snap that mount right off. So because this mount, which is supplied with the kit, is going to handle the entire load of the rear suspension, they give you this really nice, this is probably 1/4 inch and the rest of the stuff looks like 3/16 bracketry. This straddles the lower control arm, and this is for the left side, so this will be, this is actually gonna move the shock mount for way inboard. And that's the other advantage on the early Chevelles is in the stock location, the shock mount at the bottom is very close. If you start to move the wheel inboard with a wider wheel package with more offset, then what will happen is the wheel will actually, or the tire will actually crash into the lower shock mount. The beauty of this kit is it relocates the spring and shock further inboard, which does 2 things. It more stands it up, whereas before the shock was like this. As you make the shock more vertical, it actually has more energy to it. It's more a 1-to-1 situation where at an angle there's a vector. So that's another advantage to it. The upper mount distributes the load into the cross member. The bolt goes through here to mount to the shock at the top, and all the hardware is supplied. It's all grade 8 good stuff. So and we will have to drill the holes out, but we'll show you all that in the installation. Then the spring again is this one is rebound adjustable rather than compression in the front. This is rebound adjustable, but you have 11 different connections that or adjustments that you can make, and the rest of it's all pretty much just like the front in terms of the Torrington bearing, adjustable ride height, and then the spring rate is 160 pounds per inch. Okay, to get started, the first thing you want to do is make sure the frame is properly supported with a jack stand back here underneath the frame right here. And then as we take this apart, we have to be very careful to make sure that you let the spring pressure down as easily as possible, because the original stock springs especially are real tall. They don't have a lot of rate, but they're real tall. And as you lower this control arm down, you usually can let the spring off. These springs are actually very short, so those are gonna pop right out. But, and we've kind of pre-assembled this car a little bit, so it's fairly simple. So it's gonna come apart really easily. But all we're gonna do is just take the shocks off, and then we'll spin this out, and the shock will come right out the bottom. And then the next thing we're going to do is take the sway bar bracket off here, and that will we'll save all this stuff because Robert's going to put it right back on again after we're done. So once you've pulled the cotter pin out, you want to loosen this bolt a little bit. You've obviously got your floor jack underneath the control arm, but there's space in between here. And what we're going to do is we're going to loosen the ball joint and give it about 4 threads or so, and then just to have enough clearance, and then you're going to whack the spindle with a hammer, and that should release the taper on the ball joint. And then now what you can do is jack it up and go ahead and pull this off, and then we'll pull the spindle off and get it out of the way. Okay, so now all we have to do, the ball joint is loose. Pull this up out of the way, and now we can go ahead and lower the floor jack, and that will take the spring pressure off. Okay, you can see we had to take the header off in order to get the lower control arm down low enough that we could pull the spring out. You can see these are quite a bit shorter springs. They're a bigger wire diameter. This is probably a 700-pound per inch spring, something like that. But with a ride height adjustment like this, it won't be an issue. So now that we've got this out of the way, now we have to take the lower control arm off because we have to take the two nuts at the bottom. We have to cut them out. Okay, so what we need to do next is these small nuts that hold the lower shock in place on the stock application need to be removed because the lower mount has to sit flush on this pad. So what we're going to do is take a die grinder and cut these in half, two different ways, and then we'll chisel them out. So we're just going to cut these now. Final modification to the lower control arm is these bolts are 5/16 that hold the original shock on, and the new mount's going to have 3/8 bolts, so we have to enlarge these holes. Pretty simple stuff. You just stick the drill bit in there and drill it out. Okay, so now that we've removed the nuts on the bottom and drilled the holes out, and then we went ahead and put the lower control arm back in place. Now what we're going to do is we're going to slip the spring over the shock and slip it up inside here and hang it from the top stud here, and then we'll pull the lower control arm up. So this portion of the frame here is the upper spring pocket for the stock frame. So now we've got the shock hanging from the stud. I'm going to have to go underneath with a flashlight, and the end of the spring needs to be indexed. There's a small little notch where the end of the spring fits, and you just want to make sure the end of the spring on the coilover is in that notch so it positions it properly. If you go past it, it'll push the spring down and it won't be evenly loaded, and it will tend to put pressure on the end of the spring. So just take a flashlight, go underneath the car and look up underneath there and make sure you get it dialed in. Okay, so now we have the floor jack under the lower control arm. The shock is supported at the top with a stud. Now we're going to take our two 3/8 bolts, put them in from the top down through, and that will locate the shock in the lower control arm. Then we can go ahead and start reassembling the rest of it. So now what we're doing, we've got the bolts in through the shock, and now I'm just starting the nuts on the bottom side. Now it's positioned properly. Now we can go ahead and get the spindle back on to the lower control arm. Okay, there you go. Now, there it goes. That's what the problem was. All right. Okay, to assemble the sway bar link, you start with a bushing on a washer, and then the bushing, then come up from the bottom, and then the nub on the bottom goes to the control arm, and then a washer, and then the spacer. I got the washer on backwards. Then a spacer, then another washer, and then this. Come up through the bottom like that. Another one on the bottom, and one more washer, and the nut, and then we shouldn't really tighten all this down until you get the car on the ground and set the ride height, and then you tighten all this stuff up. So we'll just assemble it right now, close. Now we need to go ahead and finish the shock mount at the top as well. So we'll take this washer, stick it on there, and then once we get all this on the ground and tightened up and cinched down, then we'll lock it with a second nut, and that'll keep this from loosening up. But for right now, we can just kind of do a quick turn, a few turns to make sure it's tight. And then what we can do is now torque the two bottom bolts to make sure that they're tight. So we're just gonna there we are, torqued at 35. Okay, so to adjust the ride height, they give you this tool and it fits in on the bottom of that panel. The adjuster just locks in place, and then you just turn this to tighten it. And it's not going to be easy, but you can do it. Probably would be easier if the end link was not in. On the top of the shock, basically you just want to tighten this up until there's really not a torque spec necessarily. You just tighten it up until the bushing is compressed enough, but not squished out or anything like that. So probably along the lines of something like that. And then we just put the lock nut on. And you're ready to go. Okay, now we've moved to the rear, and we've got our floor jack under the rear end. And the first thing we're going to do is we've got the rear end supported. So the first thing we're going to do is take the shocks, mount loose, take the shock off, pull the spring out, and then remove the lower control arm at the rear, and then we can put our bracket in. Okay, we've got the jack under the rear end, we have the spring out and the shock off and the lower control arm bolt out. Now what we're going to do is this is going to go in, it's going to straddle the lower control arm mount, bolt's going to go through both mounts, and then this will go to the original shock mount down here, and this will be our new shock mount for the bottom. So when you remove the lower control arm, the first thing the rear end wants to do is go that way because the spring pressure on the other side is going to kick it back. So what I do is just hook up a little come along here, just a little ratchet strap, hook it to the rear end housing, and you can see it just pulls it forward. As it pulls it forward, it will eventually line my lower control arm mounting bolt up and should be able to pound it through. Just like that. So now that we've got the lower bracket configured, now we have to put our upper brackets in. These are 5/16, so we have to drill them out with a 3/8 drill bit because that's the bolts we're going to be using. What I've learned on doing the other side is I'm going to pre-configure this bracket first, and then we're going to put the shock on from the bottom and then line the bolts up from the bottom. But in order to do this first, we have to cut this little zip tie off so we don't lose our washers. And then you can see this is set up like a oval, and the square part goes to the inboard side to the chassis so that there's more clearance on that side. Okay, now we've got our shock configured with the upper mount, and we're just going to put the bolt in from the bottom and slide it in that way because I've found that it's a little bit easier to do it this way. Okay, before we put all this up inside, there's a couple things you have to be aware of. The square part of this bracket goes to the inboard side because if you have it around the other way, it'll bind up inside here. So this rounded part goes to the outside, square part to the inside, but you also want to make sure that you have your adjuster on the inboard side. If not, if you spin it around, this bracket will be wrong. So you have to have both of these in the proper orientation along with the bolts up through the bottom in order to line all this up. So what we did was jack the floor jack up to bring this up into place, line these two bolts up through, run them up through. We pulled them through with regular nuts, and now that we have the regular nuts in place, we can spin these off and go ahead and put the locking nuts in place and tighten them up. Okay, so now we've got the shock in place, the bolts are through. There's 20 foot-pounds on both. We've already got that one done. And now we'll go down to the bottom ones. All right, here we go. So this is basically the old shock mount. Okay, so I've got everything torqued in place. I'm a little out of breath. If you want, you can cut these bolts off if you think it may touch the body. I actually don't, if this is the body height right about here, so I think it'll clear. But if you want to, that's fine. It's just if you have to take it back apart, you might need this length of bolt in order to get the bolt started. So we've torqued everything in place. Now the only thing left to do that we've actually done is to set the ride height by adjusting it to the bottom. And just keep in mind that when it comes to installing these systems, that if you change the ride height, every time you change the ride height, whether it be the front or the rear, that affects the alignment. So even changing the rear ride height, let's say you lower the rear ride height, that'll actually change your caster up front. And conversely, if you jack the back end of the car up, it takes positive caster out and essentially changes your alignment, and it could very well change a lot of other things too. So just keep in mind that what you should really do is choose alignment or choose a ride height that you like and stay with it, because every time you modify it, you have to change your alignment. But actually wasn't that difficult to do. We did 2 sides in probably a couple of hours, shooting video along the way, so it worked out very well. So follow us along, hit the bell, subscribe, tell your friends, and we'll keep doing Just Miss Garage.